Imagine a little girl walking through the drafty corridors of a stone castle, her slippers too big, her body still so slight it looks as if the weight of the gown draped over her shoulders might topple her. That little girl was Margaret Beaufort, and though history would later remember her as the iron-willed mother of England's first Tudor king, at this moment she was only 12 years old, still a child, still a daughter who clung to the comfort of her prayers and her books, not yet prepared for the brutal demands that fate was about to thrust upon her. Margaret had been raised on stories that she was chosen, that her bloodline carried a sacred thread of destiny. The Beauforts were descended from John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III, and though they were technically barred from the throne by a royal decree, ambition runs thicker than parchment. The men around her whispered of possibility, of crowns that might one day be claimed through her. But Margaret did not yet understand. She only knew the cool echo of church hymns, the delicate stitching of embroidery, and the fleeting joy of running through the gardens with her friends, pretending they were queens of imaginary realms. She was still a child, one who sometimes wept when the wind howled too fiercely at night, one who tucked herself beneath heavy covers and prayed for angels to watch over her. Yet in 1455, the Wars of the Roses had torn England apart. Lancaster and York clashed over the throne, and every noble family scrambled to protect its place. Margaret, with her Lancastrian blood, was more than just a girl. She was a pawn, a vessel, a thread of legitimacy. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, and her guardians knew the value of that blood. A marriage could seal alliances, and in those years of chaos, alliances were worth more than gold. So when Edmund Tudor, the king's half-brother, came forward as a suitor, Margaret had no say. Edmund was not cruel in appearance, he was young, handsome enough, ambitious without apology, but he was a man, grown and full of authority, while she was barely past childhood. On the day the betrothal was spoken aloud, Margaret's hands trembled in her lap. She sat silently as the men discussed her future over her head, their voices rising and falling like hammer strokes sealing her fate. She tried to meet her mother's eyes, hoping for a gentle protest, but her mother only laid a hand over hers, soft but firm, as if to say, "This is God's will." When the wedding day came, Margaret felt as though she were walking in a dream. Her dress was heavy, its embroidery too fine for her young shoulders. The chapel smelled of incense, the priest's words droned on, and she whispered her vows with a voice so thin it nearly vanished beneath the vaulted ceilings. When Edmund took her hand, she did not look up. She thought of her prayers, of the psalms she knew by heart, of the saints who had suffered young and found strength in their trials. She thought perhaps she, too, was being tested. The castle she entered as Edmund's bride was vast, its corridors dimly lit by torches, its windows narrow slits that let in little warmth. She wandered those halls like a shadow, her small steps echoing against the stone. Servants bowed as she passed, but their eyes followed her, pitying, curious, uncertain what to make of this child who had been crowned with the responsibilities of a woman. At meals, she sat quietly, her plate untouched, listening to the men speak of war, of politics, of enemies and betrayals. Edmund would sometimes glance at her, his expression unreadable, but there was no gentleness in his gaze. He did not see the frightened girl clutching rosary beads under the table. He saw a wife, a future mother, and with her, the chance to bind his family closer to the royal bloodline. At night, when the castle fell silent, Margaret prayed. She knelt on the hard floor until her knees ached, whispering her pleas to the Virgin Mary, asking for guidance, for strength, for some measure of peace. She prayed for her father, whom she barely remembered, for her mother's health, and for her own soul, which felt battered by demands she could not comprehend. She prayed most fervently that God would forgive her fear, for she knew she was supposed to be brave, obedient, and devout. It was during those nights that the reality of her marriage sank in. Edmund expected her not as a companion but as a vessel for heirs. He visited her chambers, and Margaret endured with the quiet resignation of a child who had been told all her life that suffering was holy, that sacrifice brought salvation. She was frightened, but she kept silent. There was no one to whom she could confess her dread. Her maids whispered in corners, but they offered no comfort. She was alone, trapped in the role history had carved for her. Within months, the whispers began. The ladies in waiting exchanged knowing looks. Servants lowered their eyes when she passed. Margaret herself felt the truth before anyone dared speak it aloud. Her body was changing. Her courses had not come, her appetite waned, and sickness gripped her in the mornings. She was barely 13, yet she was carrying a child. The knowledge filled her with terror. She had seen women labor before, had heard the screams, had glimpsed the blood. But those women were grown, strong, their hips wide with the experience of age. Margaret's body was still slight, her frame narrow, her strength untested. How could she survive what was to come? When Edmund was told, his pride swelled. A son, perhaps, an heir, what greater blessing? He spoke of it at table, his voice booming with satisfaction, his hand resting possessively on Margaret's shoulder. To the men around him, it was triumph. To Margaret, it was a sentence. She lowered her gaze, cheeks burning, and pressed her lips together to hide the trembling. The months dragged on. Margaret's belly swelled, and with it her fear. Her gowns no longer fit, her body felt foreign, heavy, fragile. Each step echoed the truth that she was a child no longer, though her heart still longed for the innocence of games and laughter. Her prayers grew more desperate. She asked not for her own life, but for the life of the child within her. If she could endure, if she could bring him safely into the world, perhaps her suffering would have meaning. Perhaps God had chosen her for this alone. But as the time drew near, whispers turned to murmurs of dread. Midwives shook their heads, saying the girl was too young, too frail. Some muttered that she might not live to see her 14th birthday. Servants crossed themselves when they saw her pale face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she clutched her swollen belly as if she could shield it from fate itself. And yet Margaret walked with a kind of fragile dignity. Though fear gnawed at her, she carried herself as if the weight of destiny were a mantle she could not lay down. In her heart, she was still that little girl wandering cold corridors, longing for the warmth of a mother's embrace. But history had already decided her path, and her steps carried her forward toward the trial that would define her life forever. She was 13, pregnant, and carrying the boy who would one day be king. The night the labor began, the air was heavy with winter. The wind clawed at the shutters, howling through the cracks in the stone walls of Pembroke Castle as if the world itself were holding its breath. Margaret Beaufort, scarcely more than a child, lay pale and trembling on the bed, her hands clutching the sheets with a desperation that no one of her age should have known. She was only 13, her frame narrow, her body slight, and yet she bore within her the future of a dynasty. The pains had started earlier in the day, sharp, relentless waves that left her gasping. At first, she had clung to hope that it was false, that perhaps she could hold off the inevitable. But as the sun set and the castle fell into shadow, the truth could no longer be denied. Her time had come, though her body was unready. The midwives bustled around her, whispering to one another in voices that never quite reached her ears. Their faces were grim, their eyes filled with doubt. They had seen women die in childbirth, women grown and strong, women whose hips had borne many children before. Margaret was none of those things. She was young, fragile, her bones not yet settled into womanhood, and every contraction seemed to tear her apart. The midwives exchanged worried glances, silently wondering whether both mother and child would survive the night. Margaret's lips moved constantly, murmuring prayers through her tears. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for me, pray for him, deliver us both. She clutched the rosary beads at her side until they cut into her palms, as though the pain of their edges might anchor her against the storm surging within her body. The cries that tore from her throat echoed down the corridors, unsettling the servants who huddled near the fire. Even hardened soldiers shifted uneasily, crossing themselves as the child bride's voice rose and fell, pleading, breaking, fighting for life. Hours dragged into a blur of agony. Sweat soaked her brow, her hair clung damp against her face, and her breaths came ragged, shallow, as though she had been running for miles. She was so small that the midwives feared the child could never pass. They whispered of prayers, of miracles, of saints who might intercede. One muttered that God would not allow the vessel of such a destiny to perish. Another shook her head, fearing that heaven's will was not always kind. Margaret herself hovered between terror and determination. She thought of her mother, of the day she had been married off like a lamb led to slaughter. She thought of Edmund Tudor, her husband, who had spoken of heirs with pride in his voice, who had seen in her not a girl but a future. And most of all, she thought of the child within her, the boy she had already begun to love despite her fear, the life she cradled in her prayers every night. She whispered to him now, though her voice was broken by screams. "Hold on, little one, hold on." The hours stretched into a day, then another. Margaret's strength waned, her face growing whiter with each passing hour, her body trembling violently as if it were splitting apart. At one point, her vision blurred, and she thought she saw angels hovering in the corners of the chamber, their faces neither kind nor cruel, only watchful. She wondered if they had come to carry her away. But she clung to life with a ferocity born not of years but of faith. If she must suffer, she told herself, let it be for him. If she must die, let him live. At last, after nearly 3 days of torment, the chamber filled with the sound of an infant's cry. Thin at first, but rising, filling the air with proof of life. The midwives sighed in relief, some crossing themselves, some weeping openly. Margaret, exhausted beyond words, turned her head toward the sound. She could not lift her arms, could not even open her eyes fully, but when they placed the swaddled child beside her, she felt a surge of warmth unlike any she had ever known. Her son, Henry. She traced his tiny face with trembling fingers, his skin soft as rose petals, his breath warm against her cheek. He was alive, against every expectation, against the terror that had haunted the castle for days. Both mother and child had survived. It felt like a miracle, and in her heart, Margaret believed it was nothing less. Yet the victory was cruelly laced with sorrow. The midwives and physicians knew what she would soon discover: her body was scarred beyond repair. The labor had ravaged her, leaving her weak and broken. The child she had brought into the world would be her only one. At 13, Margaret's womb was closed to the possibility of bearing more children. It was as though fate had decreed that her suffering should carve a single path, that her entire legacy would rest in the life of this fragile infant boy. When Edmund Tudor's death reached her not long after, the news struck like another blow. Widowed at 14, with an infant son in her arms, Margaret found herself alone in a world that demanded strength she scarcely believed she possessed. She had no husband to protect her, no father to guide her, no childhood left to cling to. What she had was Henry, and Henry became her everything. The days following the birth were quiet, though the silence was heavy. Margaret spent hours gazing at her son, marveling at his tiny hands, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. She whispered to him stories of saints and kings, as though planting seeds of greatness in his infant mind. She told him he was chosen, that God had spared them both for a reason, that his life was meant for more than she could imagine. But beneath her devotion lay the memory of pain, the screams, the blood, the near brush with death. Those memories etched themselves into her very soul, shaping the woman she would become. Never again would she allow herself to be powerless. Never again would she surrender her fate into the hands of men who saw her only as a vessel. Her suffering had burned something into her. Resolve, steel, a fire that would not be extinguished. Every time she looked at Henry, she remembered the price she had paid. She knew that if she had died, he would have been alone, perhaps lost to the chaos of England's wars. She also knew that if he died, all her pain would have been for nothing. So she devoted herself utterly to him. He was not just her son, he was her purpose, her redemption, her reason for surviving the night that had nearly claimed her life. The whispers spread beyond the castle walls. Some called it a miracle. Others spoke of it as a sign that the boy born of such peril was destined for greatness. Lancaster loyalists clung to the hope that Henry might one day carry their cause. Yorkist enemies scoffed, dismissing him as the frail offspring of a child bride. But Margaret paid them no mind. Her eyes were fixed on her son, and in him she saw the future. As the years passed, she carried the scars of that birth not only in her body but in her spirit. She never bore another child, but she poured into Henry the love and ambition of a dozen mothers. She stood behind him in every trial, every battle, every moment of doubt, guiding him with the faith and iron will forged in the crucible of her own suffering. That night of screams, prayers, and blood had nearly destroyed her. But it also gave England a king. And though Margaret could not yet see it, the Tudor dynasty had begun, Not in glory or triumph, but in the desperate cries of a 13-year-old girl and the thin wail of a newborn fighting his way into the world. The child who would be Henry VII had arrived, and with him, a new chapter in England's destiny. And Margaret, broken but unbowed, had become the mother of a king.